Good afternoon. I'm Ira Katz-Nelson, currently serving as interim provost at Columbia. I feel very privileged to introduce this final session of this week's very rich and quite profound symposium on vaccines and public health, and have the chance to welcome those attending and today's very special roster of speakers. The themes, as you know, across the prior 4 days have included national, regional, and global response to an unprecedented challenge, global solutions to an unprecedented demand, ethical and societal challenges, and government and industry. And today's subject, as you know, is a most remarkable year in vaccines, which it surely has been. Please allow me to make a local observation within this global format. Here at Columbia, we are deeply indebted to our public health leaders who have kept the campus relatively safe during this terrible moment, with consistent positivity rates of under 0.5%. And now they also deserve our thanks for a wonderful local vaccine rollout, with particular attention to the Washington Heights and West Harlem communities adjacent to our campus. And we owe this significant public event to its intellectual organizers. I was invited to take this lead today by my good friend Wilmot James, who signifies the meaning of cross-national and cross-disciplinary intellectual leadership, which is the spirit that has animated these 5 days of conversations. And it's now my honor to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Mark Grodman, who serves as a member of the Columbia University Irving Medical Center Board of Advisors and has been on staff at our Vaccinology College of Physicians and Surgeons since 1983. Here at Columbia, he's made teaching rounds for more than 25 years and has created and endowed programs in alternative career tracks for our medical students. Outside Columbia, Mark has had a pioneering role in founding and leading biotech companies, in work advancing clinical genomic testing for rare, even ultra-rare disorders, and in advancing both research and policy considerations that concern, among other vital matters, women's health, patient safety, and the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So Mark, thanks for leading us today, and the floor is yours.
Provost Katz-Nelson, thank you very, very much for those kind words and for reminding me that I've been at Columbia since 1983. I actually started in 1973 when I came to attend medical school, but it clearly has been a labor of love. It is an incredible honor for me to moderate this, the final session of our 5-day virtual symposium in vaccines and global health. I think I'm just inherently drawn to complexity, and vaccines are complex. You know, the underlying research, discovery, development, it just requires an exhaustive infrastructure. And this year has seen, as we've presented, so many collaborations on so many fronts that just go behind discovery. You know, what are the study endpoints? What are the clinical trial designs? How do you recruit for all of these new platforms and new vaccines? Getting consensus on not just the efficacy, but the terms in which they're going to be evaluated. Just a few aspects that have gone into what we talk about as a remarkable year of development and achievement. But if development is complex, a vaccine solution is logarithmically more complex because it really goes beyond the science, the discovery, and development. As we'll talk about and have talked about this week, it encompasses the manufacturing, the procurement of vaccines, and we've learned all of the associated supplies. how they get deployed, where they get deployed, and how they ultimately get implemented into people's arms. There are all the intricacies of the critical and essential public and private partnerships that are done in what is in essence a competitive marketplace with the overhang of potential intellectual or IP conflicts. It's the need for greater global surveillance on disease progression, on latent complications, on the development of new variants in potentially areas without ready access to technology. It's navigating the political differences, it's the legal obstacles, and maybe above all else, sourcing the funding necessary to accomplish all of the above. And all of this is while being responsive to the ethical considerations that demand equitable access. Anything less than this kind of collaborative effort has serious consequences and will create a less secure world, probably contribute for what we're dealing with now, a greater number of variants of unclear pathological significance, economic ramifications that Lord knows we've all witnessed. But it also flies in the face of the moral imperative that we must assume. Now, I'm admittedly partial, but I think this has been an incredible week. The complexity of this sort that we're describing, it's not easy to communicate. Nuance does not do well in a 2-minute soundbite. But if we're really going to confront the inherent complexity of a holistic vaccine solution in this form, with outstanding participants that we've had from 5 continents, all of whom can speak from their expertise, their experience, and their passions, in a symposium hosted by a great university, if we can't do it here, where can we do it? It's in this context that we look forward to continuing that discussion today. The title of today is A Remarkable Year in Vaccines. But we need to be able to use this, not just talk about what we did, but to look forward. Because all the challenges to a cogent global vaccine solution, all these are well delineated prior to COVID. People knew what they were. But for me, the underlying theme is what's going to be different going forward. What stays, what goes? What progress that we made during this remarkable year and through this remarkable effort becomes institutionalized under this overwhelming presence of what is the greatest pandemic threat of our lifetime, and what reverts back to inertia and silos. That's the context, and that's, for me, the undercurrent. Where do we go from here? I am thrilled by the participants today, not only because of their accomplishment and their commitment, but also because their perspective, because they come from a variety of backgrounds and have gone beyond where they were trained to be able to contribute so much more. And that perspective is critical. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Moncef Slaoui, who until recently was chief advisor to Operation Warp Speed, which clearly has to be one of the most impactful positions in all vaccine development. Dr. Slaoui has spent 30 years at GlaxoSmithKline in multiple leadership roles as chair of Pharma R&D of Global R&D and chair of Global Vaccines. In that role, under his leadership, the vaccine portfolio of GSK grew to 48. Over one 10-year stretch, he was able to introduce 14 new vaccines, addressing clinical needs in cervical cancer, malaria, shingles, pneumococcal diseases, among many others. His perspective today is unique and we're thankful that he's here. His presentation is Lessons Learned about Delivering Vaccine in the Midst of COVID-19 Pandemic. Dr. Slaoui, thank you, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Really my pleasure to be here with you today on the day I just received my second dose of vaccine with the rest of the Operation Warp Speed team that I came back to join for the occasion. So I'm here in the office that I used to occupy until February 12th. It's been really an honor and a privilege to be the scientific advisor to the operation and co-lead this operation with General Perna, a four-star general who used to be the leader of all logistical aspects of the Department of Defense and the US Army. I thought in the 30 minutes or so I would start by summarizing what the operation was and what we did very quickly, and then extract from that the key learnings as per the theme of this conference that hopefully we're going to retain and build up on to make us better prepared for what is unfortunately very likely to happen again, pandemics of this nature. So Operation Warp Speed was really a story of integrating the efforts and the work of a number of human and health services agencies, starting with the NIH, the CDC, BARDA, and also with an arm's length kind of relationship, the FDA, integrating their efforts with those of the US Department of Defense and the Army in particular, with focus on its logistical might and also its experience in minute project management to the minute. Given that speed was and operationalization were extremely important factor in the operation. And of course, the ecosystem of the industry, from biotechs to pharmaceutical companies to suppliers. More than 50 different enterprises and companies were heavily involved on a daily basis in the scaling up and development of the vaccines that have been developed. As I joined the operation on May 15, there were 96 different vaccine programs potentially to choose from. We decided to set up a strategy to select what are we going to do based on three pillars: science, scalability from a manufacturing standpoint, and speed as the three key elements. And really elected to make our selection on the basis of what I call platform technologies for vaccination, for vaccine development, and identified 4 different platforms. As you may know, I was on the board of Moderna prior to taking on this role and chairing the R&D committee of the board, and very familiar with the Moderna messenger RNA technology overall, and in fact, vaccine in particular, but also with the work that was being done as on an ongoing basis at that point for developing a COVID-19 vaccine, and had, frankly, a strong confidence that this was likely to be a very fast, effective, and safe technology to make a vaccine. So selected messenger RNA as a platform, selected live non-replicating vector vaccines as a platform, selected the recombinant protein adjuvanted as a platform, and then a 4th platform that would be orally delivered vaccine as a 1-dose vaccine, as the ultimate objective that we can hope for. And decided within this 4 platform to have 2 candidates each. That's primarily decided on the basis of the capacity of their owners, the industry that owns them, their capacity to operationalize and their commitment to really do what it takes to go very fast and develop vaccines. This way we could manage the risk of one technology not working and another hopefully working, but also one company performing better than another within each technology. And ultimately with 8 vaccines, we were hoping we can have at least one of them come to fruition. And if we had more than one, then all the better. We'll have maybe more vaccine doses faster than if we were to build them all from the same technology. We also decided, we were given a mission to have no budgetary restrictions, and decided to assume that every single program, every single experiment was going to work, and therefore plan everything on the basis of success. And for instance, recruit all phase 3 trial sites prior to knowing whether the phase 1 completed positively, or start manufacturing and scale up and building the manufacturing sites before we knew whether the vaccines were immunogenic, sometimes even in primates. All in all, 4 of the platform didn't perform. 1 didn't perform, 3 performed. 6 vaccines were selected. 5 out of the 6 vaccines have turned out to be positive in phase 3 trial. The 6th one just didn't start phase 3 trial yet, has been delayed, the Sanofi partnership recombinant protein. And of the 5 vaccines that completed phase 3, 3 have been approved, 2 in the US, 3rd one outside of the US, the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the 4th vaccine is likely to be, I hope, approved today, as there is a VRBPAC to review it. So I think really important progress and a very good performance by the thousands and tens of thousands of people in the industry, in the agencies, in the army that have participated to do the work, and then the tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of volunteers that participated into the trial. So, and as you know, we're now vaccinating, and I'll come back to some of the points around the vaccination. So the operation really, the role was to synchronize, coordinate, lead, and really make the key strategic choices. And then on a daily basis, on a minute per minute basis, as we learned from the operational approach that the Army has, to operationalize and make happen all the plans. So what are the key learnings that at least I extract from this? I think the first one, and the super important one, is that science matters, and science has allowed us to design vaccines and to, I'm confident, be able to be to control a major pandemic that effectively has impacted the global world at a level that no one was able to imagine before. We may not be able to fully control it. There may be variants, and I'm sure we'll discuss this kind of things. But these vaccines are going to allow us to, I think, go back to a more normal life. So science has served, and we need to continue always investing in research, in development, and listening to what science tells us. I think the other within that learning is that the industry ecosystem is helping us save the world. Without the pharmaceutical industry, without the biotech industry, without the suppliers, without all those activities next to the academic science that really has created the knowledge, we wouldn't be able to do what we have done. Second, really an important point is the organizational approach that was taken. As I took on the role, I unknowingly, actually, really, I put my finger on what turned out to be 2 things that really were critical for success. And they were my only 2 asks from the administration as I was asked to do this role. One was full empowerment. The decision had to be taken immediately, and therefore the team had to be empowered. And the second one was non-interference. And the third one, which is in the choice of the leadership that they took, was to select leaders, whether General Perna or myself, that had nothing to do with the world in which we were to perform. We had no past and no future in the human and health services agencies, or effectively directly into the industry, since we separated from them, that we were interacting with. And that was super important because there are, as always, there are fiefdoms, there is history, there are inhibition that can stand into the way of how decisions are made. And this helped us by literally ignoring them, all these historical things and fiefdoms and politics and you name it. It allows us to really focus 100% on a singular objective, which is to make vaccines and therapeutics against COVID-19 as quickly as possible for the American people and for the world. And it turned out to be super important. And to be honest, as we progressed towards having vaccines and distributing them, etc., the impact of interference and politics started to grow little by little, and the performance potentially was or is impacted by that. Learning is that we now really have at least 2 platform technologies for vaccines that are incredibly fast, incredibly effective. Nobody was able to predict that we would have a 95% effective vaccine using a new platform technology, and to achieve that in a period of 9 months or 10 months. And this is really something that's really important to build on, because now we know this can be done. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. What was really great, also learning that I hope we're going to keep, is the regulatory approach that finally espoused the concept of a real platform technology. What do I mean by that? If I take a messenger RNA vaccine against CMV and a messenger RNA vaccine against COVID-19, and let's assume it's exactly the same length protein, just for a minute. Those 2 vaccines are chemically identical, since we have to choose from 4 nucleotides and we just sort them in a different order across the sequence. And therefore, their toxicology, their safety in terms of the intrinsic safety of the compound, the manufacturing processes, the characterization, the quality control criteria, everything that usually takes months and years to go through can be predictable. And the reason messenger RNA vaccines went so fast is that the FDA has decided effectively and acted on these technologies as a platform technology. And even more now, as you have, I'm sure, seen 2 days ago, Moderna, for instance, announcing that they're going to start clinical trials in partnership with the NIH with some of the variants. It's going even faster because the level of identity is even, of course, bigger. But that's a really important point, because we can go much faster, very quickly, in a safe way, and get into the clinic very quickly with these technologies, where 99% of different vaccines are actually identical. And of course, the antigen specific features will remain to be tested, but the chemical composition is identical. Another important learning that we should build upon and enhance is the existence of clinical trial networks. And in particular, the HIV clinical trial network that the NIH and NIAID and VRC have created and maintained over 3 decades have turned out to be absolutely vital and instrumental in relabeling itself as the CoVPN vaccine network for COVID, and being immediately available to drive the clinical development, but also to input into the clinical trial designs. As you know, we were not able, and it would have been, I think, a mistake to think about comparative trial where we would run all these vaccine one against the other, because we would have delayed everything. But we wanted to harmonize the vaccine trial designs in order to be able to, within reason, compare one vaccine to the other in terms of endpoints, study population, assays, and things like that. The CoVPN network has been critical in helping us in the process of that harmonization, but also in the execution of the clinical trial, with particular attention on ensuring that the populations recruited in the clinical trials here in the US in particular were representative of the diversity we have into the population. And that was something that was of particular attention and focus as we went through the process of doing the clinical trials. And I want to contrast that with the challenges we have experienced with therapeutics, where by the time we started to think about clinical trials, as you know, there was the active network, etc. The issue was there were more than 400 clinical trials, most of which single arm based on historical comparison that were running, and on average they had 10 subjects in a study. And these were driven by the passion of all the investigators to help the world, the system, the patients come out of their disease. But the challenge of that is that there was a paucity of sites, a paucity of subjects that we could recruit early on. And it turned out to be really difficult to start clinical trials very quickly. So a key learning is to maintain, but also build on more clinical trial sites and network, both for prophylaxis and for therapeutics. The biggest challenge and the biggest learning was the manufacturing. Manufacturing is an issue in the sense that there is no rationale for an enterprise that is a private enterprise. There's no rationale to have a manufacturing capacity that's idle, that's ready to use. So appropriate equipment, validated, approved by regulators, having a workforce that is trained and is also approved by the workforce, and processes that can be approvable. There's absolutely no rationale to have that waiting idle for the next pandemic to happen. Any manufacturing facility that's running will be a manufacturing facility that has an objective. And if we are to use it for a new pandemic, we're going to have to either, we're going to have to divert its focus and certainly re-equip it, at least tweak its infrastructure and its equipment, retrain its workforce, and that's what we have done. And in fact, when you see what vaccines are making it, the 2 messenger RNA vaccine were from a technology for which there was no pre-existing approved product, so there was nothing to displace. And frankly, we were lucky in both cases, whether it was BioNTech or Moderna, that the companies had decided to start building up their manufacturing capacity, which was not directed for an approved product, was directed for products in development that were diverted. The second type of programs, which was the live vectored vaccines, non-replicating, were really a challenge. We had to use a network of manufacturing facilities that BARDA had created that then had to be skilled, equipped, trained, and then the scale-up process for those vaccines, the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Janssen J&J vaccine, were scaled up. And that's one of the reasons why, actually, in contrast to the messenger RNA, the clinical trial outcomes and the vaccines are available slightly later. I mean, it makes me laugh to say this, frankly, because as you know, before this process, the fastest vaccine development had taken 4 to 5 years. And here, something that's taking 14 months is really late, and something as compared to something that took 10 months. But that's the challenge of a pandemic. And that's what we need to be better prepared for going forward. The protein-based vaccine were also very challenging to manufacture. Novavax didn't have manufacturing facilities, and we also used a contract manufacturer that needed to be literally build the manufacturing site and equip it. And Sanofi ultimately had to reuse one of their manufacturing facilities for flu vaccine that's produced in the same technology to produce their vaccine, and it's one of the reasons of the delays and partially. So manufacturing is a key problem and a key challenge, and certainly we could have gone faster if we had capacity available and usable immediately. The next learning is like producing vaccines and shipping vaccines all the way to 40,000 different sites now doesn't mean that people will get vaccinated. And that's certainly a very hard learning for the operation in particular, in that assuming that people tell us you can send the vaccine dose to this particular location means they are ready to immunize, but that is not the case. And really investing in the capacity to immunize, particularly in a country where the health system is as fractionated as it is in the US, is a very, very important thing to think through, learn from what's being done now under this new administration and build up on it. But it's still much slower than what's happening in other countries where the health system is much more integrated and centralized. Another area of learning that we need to build on is on the communication. The operation didn't really underestimated the importance of communication, and also the conditions didn't allow for a good start. When we started, we were negotiating multi-billion-dollar agreements with each of the companies with which finally we did do these agreements, and the SEC rules are such that you cannot talk about them. And one of the issues was for a period of about 4 or 5 weeks, between the middle of May and almost the end of June, we didn't communicate anything. And that was a mistake because it has created, given the political context in which this pandemic has happened, it has really created big challenges in terms of trust, in terms of miscommunication that were then really difficult to come out from. And also just the vaccine hesitancy and the importance of having really a well thought through from day one strategy to engage the population. We did it in part through the recruitment in the clinical trial, as I spoke about with the CoVPN network in particular, but it's something really to work out very heavily. And one point I'll make, but this is more kind of on a joke side of things, but not so much of a joke in as we were going on, is please, next pandemic don't happen on an election year. It was a really difficult to keep science at the forefront and communication being really where the media of all sorts being biased in the way communication was happened is again didn't help. I thought these were the big areas, at least where some learnings can be built on and further improved. But my final take-home message is that with all of this, the biggest learning is we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic. And it's a little bit frustrating to me to know that after the pandemic flu in the late 2000s, and then the Ebola outbreak and the Zika outbreak, and experiencing as the head of R&D and also chairman of the vaccine division of GSK, the level of challenge that a company that was really committed to global health and public health, how difficult it was to continue to respond to our investors' requirement and at the same time use our capacity, capabilities, technologies for the good of helping the population with outbreaks. It's not sustainable, it's not workable. And we need to be able to have organizations and in particular manufacturing capabilities and capacity available to immediately tackle outbreaks when they happen. And in 2014, we built a proposal that we called the Biodefense Preparedness Organization and offered the whole facility that used to be the Human Genome Sciences Center in Rockville, Maryland, for those of you who know it, that had 10,000 liter fermenter capacities, industrial scale, heavy industrial scale for biopharmaceutical manufacturing, very large R&D laboratories and capacity to host an organization whose role in life will be to use platform technologies for vaccines and make vaccines against the list of potential pandemic agents as per the WHO list. And that would allow that organization to be skilled at discovering and developing vaccine and manufacturing them all the time, because that's what it will be doing all the time. And if and when a pandemic happens, either a pathogen that was by luck selected as one of the vaccines for which a vaccine was produced, then we could immediately further scale up and produce more vaccine doses of a vaccine that existed already, or we could immediately divert that organization as a whole to discovering and developing a vaccine against whatever that new pathogen that's a new pandemic agent is. And now, more than 5-7 years ago, we know we have platform technologies that are so much better than the ones we had at the time, and they're validated and we know how they work. My hope now is at the global level to have such committed organization of R&D, small R&D, because we know which platform technologies to use, and more of a process development, scale up and manufacturing capacity in each one of the continents that are connected and collaborate in a way that they go through the list in a coordinated way of those potential pandemic agents. And if and when a pandemic happens, we have 4 or 5 or 6 manufacturing sites and organizations that are able to respond instantly and allow for availability of vaccines on a global basis immediately. if that was possible. I'll stop there. I hope this was interesting and look forward to having to listening to the other presentation and having an interesting Q&A. Thank you.
Dr. Slattery, thank you very much. I mean, that was a remarkable presentation, especially in the way that you were able to weave together the different component parts and about what played a role and what didn't. And we have a few minutes ahead of the next presentation. You described that we've made a lot of headway in terms of the infrastructure necessary for development, the clinical trial network, what's already been established. There's a lot been done with the platforms that can be done. You raised the question about the manufacturing, which still is to be resolved. And how much of the just working between the public-private partnership is a bit of a difficult area where there are a lot of divergent interests. Can what was accomplished been accomplished without the political will? The fact that we are going to do this no matter what and cut through not only the bureaucracy, but cut through any other, whatever interests there were, that it just forced everyone to say we're going to do it, not as much for what happened now, but what does that mean going forward? Can we ever come to a point of where there can be a cogent solution without the overwhelming political, vested interest to say we're going to do this and go through all the roadblocks?
It's really interesting in that, honestly, I think every participant was instantly aligned on the objective, given how humongous the impact of this pandemic was. So, the private sector, for instance, didn't wait for the contracts to be approved or agreed before starting the work. We started working on May 16th. No contract was signed before the very end of June, except for the AstraZeneca, which was signed on May 14th. And the companies just trusted the system. I think the government really took a very pragmatic perspective in terms of the contractual requirements and the bureaucracy that's put onto the companies to do the work, and the access to the IP knowledge, etc. All those things that can be really significant roadblocks and take time to resolve have been resolved in a very pragmatic way. I think it was wise to take somebody from the industry with experience to help lead this, because I could translate the Chinese of one side to the Chinese of the other side in a way that demonstrated that people are actually aligned, and because there's a huge objective like this, and everything else is only 1% of the problem. And once you see that, you can move forward very quickly. And I think for now going forward, we know it can be done. I can't imagine that it shouldn't be done. It can be done. I tell you, the biggest problem is going to be, I hope, in contrast to what has happened after the flu pandemic. After the flu pandemic, what has happened is, because that particular H1N1 didn't kill everybody, it was, if you remember, a lot of stories around the fact that this was all created by the industry to sell more vaccines. And it was very difficult for those who really let go of everything and put their effort behind it to have a backlash of that situation. I do hope now that as a global world, we are going to understand, with the appropriate controls, etc., what the role and the value add of each player has had, and acknowledge it, including the industry. It's not always a devil in the system, and I just dare say it. I think it was easier to align everybody than one would have thought, and it was not a problem to ignore the bureaucracy and the fiefdoms and the politics.
That's great. That was remarkable. You mentioned what it's like to communicate, because how difficult it is to communicate these challenges, because the bad messaging can go in and will do in any great intentions. We have Kai Cooper, who will talk later about the role of how we can communicate, which is kind of, the issues and the challenges. Please stay on. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful perspective. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Zeke Emanuel, who is currently the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's also a university professor and co-director of the Healthcare Transformation Institute. As I was speaking with him before the session, Dr. Emanuel is an oncologist. I think of myself as a clinician. It kind of goes back to the basics of how you view problems as being patient-centric. If there was anyone who's ever been able to go embody a physician who has moved out of into other areas, it's him. His MD was he not only achieved an MD, but a PhD as well in political philosophy. And Woody has gained as much of a reputation as a bioethicist. He may well be the most cited bioethicist in history. He's the author of 300 articles, and his latest book is Which Country Has the Best Healthcare? Dr. Emanuel, it is a pleasure to have you join us for your perspective. The title of his presentation is Using Vaccines Optimally in the Future, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mark. It's a great honor to be here and a great honor to follow Dr. Slaoui in a very, very wonderful presentation about what led to the rapid development of the vaccines. It truly is remarkable. It is one of those silver linings of this disaster that we do now know that the speed with which we can go forward. We have new platforms, as he pointed out. We also have new regulatory arrangements that have shown us how much faster we can move on the regulation without sacrificing rigor at all. I'm going to talk about what comes next, the distribution issues and how to think about the distribution issues from both a ethical standpoint and a practical standpoint, and I dearly hope that what I'm saying is about how we can marry those two perspectives. After all, we do have to marry those two perspectives. I do have slides. I hope people can see the slides. Is that true? Are people seeing the
They're
slides?
fine. I see them. I see it fine.
Okay. Inevitably, and I'm going to give a caveat here. Inevitably, I am going to venture into highly controversial areas. Why? Because what we're dealing with now in the vaccine, and I might say for the foreseeable future, is what us bioethicists and ethicists call an absolute scarcity of a life-saving resource. It's an absolute scarcity because pretty much no matter what we do for the next months, I would say probably years, we are not going to have enough vaccine for the world. We have 7.8 billion people, and even under optimistic scenarios, it's going to take several years to get everyone vaccinated, and who knows, that could be thrown off because of these variants. It could be thrown off because the durability of these vaccines is such that it's short, and I believe very heartened to hear Dr. Slaoui's view on how we might enhance production and manufacturing, putting facilities in all continents. But even if we had that, there's going to be a long delay of months or years of getting everyone vaccinated. So how do we think about distributing the kind of vaccine we have to the world? That's what I spend my time thinking about. And it's vitally important because it does impact how well we respond to the pandemic. It impacts issues of ethics and justice. It's not an afterthought. It is a forethought. It's something we have to think about right away from the start. And broadly speaking, everyone has said we need to distribute vaccine equitably among countries, among people. The real question for all of us is, what does equitable mean? And if you read a lot of those articles that call for equity and fairness, whatever phrase they use, they are awfully thin on defining equity. I would say that over the last, I don't know, 6-8 months, two conceptions of equity in the distribution of vaccine have come about. One conception comes from the WHO, and has informed the COVAX proposal. And that is to distribute vaccine on the basis of population. So you distribute the limited supply we have. The initial view of the WHO is that you give 3% to every country and then increase to 20% of their population. The initial 3% is to cover healthcare workers and other very high-risk populations, and then go to 20%. And after you get to 20% of every country's population, we switch over to distributing on the basis of severity approach to different countries. That, as I said, has been the WHO approach, and that has been the COVAX approach. An alternative, which a group of ethicists, public health experts from 10 different countries, led by myself, is claims to be a more fair allocation. And it really looks at not population, but COVID burden. In phase 1, the goal is to prevent premature deaths directly caused by COVID and indirectly caused by COVID, those so-called excess mortality as a result of COVID, whether it's from heart attacks because people don't go to the hospital, or cancer because they don't get diagnosed, or infectious diseases because people don't get immunized and get other preventative services. Phase 2, and the reason to focus on initially on deaths is because they're irreversible. Phase 2 is to focus on overall economic deprivation and how much economic improvement can and poverty alleviation can be induced by giving vaccine. So that's the social and economic impacts of COVID. And then looking to curtail transmission and other areas related to COVID. So this is a COVID burden, both health burden and socioeconomic burden approach. Those have been the two dominant alternatives to understandings of what it might mean to equitably distribute vaccine among countries. If we look at the current vaccine situation, by the end of 2021, COVAX hopes that it will have $2 billion to countries, 2 billion doses to countries across the world, and about 1.8 billion will be delivered to the 92 poorest countries in the scheme, covering around 20% of their population. That's its goal. It's following, as I mentioned, the WHO notion of distributing vaccine equitably according to population size. As of mid-January, more than 7 billion vaccine doses had been purchased or optioned globally, and the lion's share, 4.2 billion, have gone to high-income countries. While high-income countries represent only 16% of the world's population, they currently hold 60% of the vaccine for COVID-19 that have been purchased or optioned so far. Many high-income countries have purchased or optioned well more than 100% of their population. This is obviously a risk-reducing approach. They didn't know when they began purchasing or optioning which vaccine would actually succeed, which wouldn't. They were placing multiple bets. But we have countries that have many multiples of their population. I believe Canada may be the country with the most vaccines per population. And here you have the confirmed number of doses purchased by country according to income levels. And you can see high income countries, then high middle income, low middle income, and poor or low income countries. High income countries, again, have about 60% of doses locked up for 60% of the population. Now, is that unequitable? You can't tell just by looking at this number, would be my argument. If you're doing or thinking or using population, the WHO's population breakdown, it is inequitable. Just no two questions about it. My position is, I think you have to dig a little deeper. This slide is an important slide, in my opinion, because it compares the purchases of vaccination with the impact of the pandemic on countries. There are some countries, and you can see them on the left here, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, where they have purchases, but they have almost no deaths. You can see the United States with way too many deaths per capita, but a high number of vaccines. Canada somewhere in between. This suggests that it's, if you use the fair priority model, it suggests that we ought to be, countries on the right-hand side ought to be receiving priority in vaccine distribution, and countries on the left should not be. And I give you a good example that contrasts the WHO's population distribution with the fair priority model that focuses on COVID burden. Just a couple of days ago, COVAX announced that its first distribution of vaccine was sent to Ghana in Africa. And I can tell you from discussions this morning with people in Ghana, this was greeted with huge excitement, big parties involving dancing and singing and a lot of excitement. I will say there's also already plans by politicians to be sure how they can get to the top of their priority list. And we could ask about that kind of prioritization within a country. But let's just stick with between country prioritization. Ghana has 30 million people roughly. Last reported had 82,000 cases of COVID, 600 deaths, and 6,500 ongoing cases as of this week. Now, even if these numbers are low, and almost assuredly they are low because of limited testing, limited diagnosis, even if you increase the numbers by, say, a factor of 10, it turns out that you'd have 6,000 total deaths. There's actually a mistake here. I don't know how I did that. Contrast that situation with Peru, that has 32 million people, so roughly the same population, but it's had 1.3 million cases of COVID, and not 4,000 deaths, but 46,000 deaths from COVID. And so you have a very different situation. And so the immediate question is, should we treat, the way the WHO says, Ghana the same as Peru in terms of distribution of vaccine, or should we treat them differently? And the fair priority model would suggest that Peru should get many more vaccines because it has had many more cases, many more deaths. It's got 80 times the number of deaths compared to Ghana. Again, even if Ghana is off by a factor of 10, Peru is still has way more burden from COVID. So the question of equity has to be the question of, do you follow, let's distribute it based on population, or should we distribute it based upon what might be deemed COVID burden, deaths, socioeconomic impact on a country? And for those of you who want to consider this, Ghana is the 60th poorest country. Peru is the 100th poorest country by per capita income. They're not exactly the same. It is true, Ghana is poorer than Peru. Peru is actually a high middle income country. Ghana is a low middle income country. So the question is, what do you think equitable distribution adheres in? Now, we know that the situation in terms of the ethics of for pharmaceutical companies, we know that the ethics before COVID, what you might call the ex ante situation, our market-based approach to distributing vaccines and other items, drugs, and diagnostics was not really optimal for an emergency. It obstructs optimal vaccine production and limits access to innovative therapies. If we allow pharmaceutical companies to charge market prices, to enforce their patent rights, we are not going to have optimal vaccine production and access during an emergency. It unfairly distributes vaccines to wealthy countries, not based upon burden. And I think we widely view this as unethical. How do we know that this is widely viewed as unethical? Well, even the pharmaceutical companies have suspended the market-based approach and repudiated it for this emergency. Moderna has said that it's not going to enforce its patents. Some companies have rushed in to produce vaccines made by other companies. So we know that the ex-ante COVID market-based approach is not deemed to be ethical. And so, we've also seen the creation of COVAX. You don't create COVAX if the system is working in its optimal. What do we think the modifications of the current institutional arrangements ought to be? There are different approaches. One is we ought to have tiered pricing. That may be appropriate, but may not be sufficient. We ought to have open licensing, not having patents enforced, not just for the vaccines, but also for their manufacturing and the tech transfer abilities. We might have a mixed bilateral, multilateral approach where some vaccines are sold bilaterally, some are sold multilaterally. That raises the question of when do you do both? What's the timing? And then we could have a complete multilateral institutional approach where all vaccine goes to an institution like COVAX, and then it distributes the vaccine. If we think about the altruistic tiered pricing approach, companies would be obligated to tier their pricing according to each country's financial capacity and donate or subsidize vaccines for the lowest income countries. They could retain patent rights, make a profit through bilateral deals. The challenge is that, again, this distribution isn't necessarily needs-based, and we're entrusting the notion of a fair distribution to companies, and they may not, even if they wanted to, know what the fair distribution is. Open licensing, companies waive their patents and intellectual property rights on vaccines, in theory, increasing vaccine production and accessibility. It's still, fair distribution is not guaranteed by open licensing. It doesn't address production bottlenecks, as Dr. Slawi mentioned, the key problem that that is really slowing this thing up. And we may need a lot more sharing than just the patents for the vaccine, but know-how in the production and facilities in the production. Mixed bilateral, multilateral approach uses a combination of traditional bilateral agreements that we've seen and international organizations like COVAX. This is more or less the status quo at the moment, but it reserves a proportion of those manufactured vaccines for the organization right from the start. It doesn't wait for a long time before it gives a vaccine to the multilateral approach. This leaves low middle income countries to share what's likely to be an insignificant quantity of vaccine late in the pandemic, while allowing wealthy countries to obtain higher quantities. And a complete multilateral approach, as if COVAX got everything, and pharmaceuticals companies forego all their bilateral deals. This is better maybe in that it centralizes distribution to ensure vaccine is distributed not by wealth, but by another mechanism, whether population or COVID demand, COVID burden, I mean. But the challenges are accountability. Criticisms about its lack of accountability, and it requires more international cooperation than exists. And whether it fulfills the ethics of distributing based upon need, that will depend upon how COVAX actually distributes vaccine. And at the moment, it's distributing on the basis of population, not need. I want to conclude by thinking about the ethics of dosing strategies inside the United States, especially in light of the rising variants. And what we've seen is a turnaround, it appears, in the number of cases. Just last week, a number of colleagues of mine and I, who are on the Biden advisory board, warned about the possibility that while we're seeing drops in the cases, that this might hide an underlying growth in cases because of the variants that lead to easier transmissibility and may be evading or able to evade some of the vaccines. There are serious questions about how we ought to approach this circumstance, given that if variants like B117 explode, we will have only a very short time. Should the focus be on following the phase 3 trial practices and protocols and getting the second dose to people in 3 or 4 weeks after the first dose? Or should we delay, not have one dose, but really delay 6, 9, 12 weeks later? Complicated both ethical considerations as well as practical considerations. A postponed second dose is more ethical. I would think it better realizes 3 key values: benefit and minimizing harm. Postponing a second dose strategy has a better prospect of maximizing benefits and minimizing harms to people if we can get more people vaccinated. And we've recently seen a switch where more people are getting their second dose than people getting their first dose. And that's likely to continue because we're distributing 1.5, 1.6 million doses a day. And we now have a backlog of people who've gotten who are now at 3 and 4 weeks post their first dose, like Dr. Slawi, and need their second dose. With a 3-week strategy, it actually takes 13 weeks to get to 100 million Americans effectively vaccinated. 13 weeks will be well beyond the variants exposure or the variant spread that could really show another surge. If we postpone the second dose, giving it at 12 weeks the way the UK is, it takes 8 weeks to get to 100 million people effectively vaccinated. That includes multiplying the number of people vaccinated by the vaccine effectiveness. That 5 weeks difference between the two could be critical. Justice requires prioritizing a large benefit for the unvaccinated over a potentially smaller benefit for those who've already received their first dose and have some significant protection. So it better allows for equality of opportunity to people who haven't been vaccinated. And I think one of the most unheralded principles that we've had is mitigating the injustice. One of the things we know is that the initial rounds now of vaccine distribution have not been equitably distributed. Whites, and especially well-off whites, have received many more doses than minorities and lower income individuals. In the state of Pennsylvania, it's been on a per capita basis, you're 4 times as likely to get a vaccine if you're white than if you're a minority. In other places like Washington, D.C., minorities, Blacks and Hispanics are 57% of the population, and they have gotten something like 30% of the vaccines. That kind of, or 20% of the vaccines, excuse me, that kind of disproportionate impact. If we continue with second doses, that will compound this inequity because it'll give the second dose more towards white and more well-off people than minorities. It locks in the initial inequities into the system. Postponing the second dose provides us the opportunity to try to crack this nut and deliver more vaccine to minority communities. So again, we might be doing better in terms of giving more people some protection than giving better protection to fewer people. And in doing that, by postponing the second dose, we would also be able to address the inequities that we've had in the initial distribution of vaccine, which I think is a very important moral obligation. Looking to the future, what we really need to do, and I think I just echoing in a slightly different language because I'm giving the language of ethics and Dr. Slawi was giving the language of vaccine discoverer and manufacturer. we need to consider the institutional arrangements and designs we have. And once we make clear how we're going to manufacture, how we're going to coordinate, who's going to distribute, how much bilateral deals, how much multilateral deals, it gets us to a better distribution arrangement that can be more ethical. Pharmaceutical companies can understand their obligations, how much they sell bilaterally, if at all, how much they give multilaterally, what the pricing strategies are. That view, let's define the institutional arrangements, and that'll specify the full ethical obligations. It's less idealistic, maybe. It may be more melioristic, but it actually takes us in a much better ethical position. So I just want to end by emphasizing there are some fundamental choices we have. As I mentioned, a fundamental choice between, does equitable distribution among countries mean population-based distribution or based upon COVID burden? Distribution in the country as the pandemic is evolving, should we stick with what the phase 3 trial protocols were, or should we shift to try to minimize the harms, maximize the benefits, and remedy inequities that the initial rollout of vaccine caused? And as you can see from my position, we have to make ethical, we have to change our practices to be more ethical along the way as this pandemic is evolving. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mandel, thank you very much. Raised a number of points that are incredibly interesting. I think I have a minute. I know I'm taking profits from other people, but hey, that's life. In the issue about laying out the dilemma, because very often equitable distribution, and we've had other calls, it's a given. This is what we're doing, this is what we're going to do, and base it on, you know, whatever the need is in the population. But what, in your other way, who makes that decision in this world going forward? So is it who is going to decide the question that you raised? It is an absolutely appropriate, logical, thoughtful question. Where does it get resolved, in what form?
That is so first you need the answer. What does equity mean? And then you need the party to enforce it. And I think you're pointing, Mark, to a very big problem, which is at this moment, especially in the world, we don't have enough international collaboration and agreement about how that kind of decision should be made. The various fora are all have some defect to them. Should it be at the WHO through the World Medical Assembly? Should it be at the UN? I think ultimately, probably neither of those is going to end up being the right thing. What we would have had happen in a few decades ago would be that the leading countries would come together, the United States, Europe, and other leading democracies, and try to give a principled justification. That hasn't happened. And I can tell you, even within the WHO, when their population-based approach was done, it wasn't done with full deliberation of the ethics group that I serve on. It hadn't, the alternative views hadn't been aired and expressed in full deliberation. That's partially a result of, what Dr. Slavi said, is we're all working under pressure. We're trying to do the right thing, but time is short. I think we are going to have some real moral leadership here, and people talking about and maybe even doing some sacrificing of their own priorities. I do also would say, look, governments are elected and legitimate by protecting the interests of their population. And that is a very important thing we need also to keep in mind as we debate all these things. I don't think there, at least in the current international arrangement, Mark, there's a simple answer to your question. I wish there were. That's as much a practical question as an ethical question.
You present a really interesting dilemma because, again, as I mentioned before, if we can't address the issue now, given what's happening, then when will we? When will that be? When will that be discussed openly? Anyway, I can't take up any more time. I'll get back to you later. Believe me, I would love to, but we'll go. We have to move on.
Well, thank you very much, Mark.
No, listen, thank you. Please, I hope you can be able to go stay around a little bit.
Absolutely. I'm waiting to hear, I think it's Peggy Hamburg next.
Absolutely. Anyway, it's my pleasure, obviously, to go introduce Peggy Hamburg, who has completed her term as Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Medicine, is the immediate past chair and president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. None of those do any justice to her remarkable career. Yes, she's the former commissioner to the FDA, one of the founders of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. She has served on multiple boards, including the Harvard University Global Advisory Council, Scientific Advisory Committee for Global Health for the Gates Foundation. She chairs the Joint Coordinating Group of CEPI, which we all know about, and is co-chair of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Developing Global Standards for Governance and Oversight of Gene Editing. As I have, on a personal note, always reminded her whenever we have spoken, as an attending on the wards of Columbia in the 1990s, when we were dealing with HIV, AIDS, and the absolutely threatened scourge of multi-drug resistant TB. She, as Commissioner of Health at those days, came in with harsh, definitive guidance on how to handle what was and could be, and for those of us who've experienced that, a horrible episode and a horrible plight. She acted decisively and over that period of time, and as far as I'm concerned, is, the finest commissioner of health we've had in New York City. So that's what means more to me. Dr. Hamburg is going to speak on reflections of vaccine development and implementation from the perspective of a former FDA commissioner. Dr. Hamburg, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. And I always like hearkening back to those days in New York City where I really learned about the joys and the challenges of public service. But today I have 10 minutes, I think, to sort of speak to the role of FDA over the last year in responding to the COVID crisis and thinking about lessons for the future. I really want to speak to a couple of important truths, in my view, things that I was aware of when I was at the FDA, but I think have been underscored in their importance in recent times, and certainly provide directions going forward. As this unfolded, we recognized that there were many, many failures, but certainly the development of a COVID vaccine was a remarkable success, and we've been talking about it, still challenges going forward. And the science community came together in remarkable ways across disciplines and sectors and borders. I think, biopharma rose to the challenge clearly. Patients, individuals, participants in the trials really need to be recognized for their contribution as well. And the FDA, really has played a central role, not always well recognized. When the COVID task force was put together by then President Trump, I quickly noticed that the FDA was not on that task force. And I reached out to Steve Hahn, then FDA commissioner, and said, you've got to get yourself on that task force, because it is going to turn out that FDA is front and center in so many of the things that need to be done. And I think, and he did push, and he did become a member. And I think he may hold it against me to this day, because it was not an easy time. But, FDA really is so central in the role of regulatory authorities more broadly. And I just want to speak to a couple of things. First, regulatory authorities are often seen as a drag to innovation and a hurdle to be avoided if possible. But in fact, FDA, when working as a true partner with the broader R&D community and the biomedical product innovation efforts, can in fact spur innovation, improve the quality of products, can help address the critical issues of scale up and manufacturing, and also help to ensure important supply chains. The fact that FDA really was at the table from the beginning made a difference in terms of deciding what were the critical scientific questions that had to be asked and answered. How could they be most efficiently addressed? What should the study designs look like to be able to compress phases of traditional vaccine R&D, but not abandon scientific rigor and make sure that the information needed for authorization or approval could be produced. And also, starting early to think about the manufacturing issues and challenges. Also, FDA, I think, played a critical role in helping to ensure that the right subpopulations were included in clinical trials to ask and answer some of the important questions, including older populations and populations of color who've been so disproportionately burdened by COVID-19. I think that it also should be recognized that FDA in its review process goes beyond just accepting the data analysis that the companies provide in their application packages, but actually undertakes its own analysis, looking at primary data, and that can make a difference. It can help ensure the quality of the analyses and uncover important aspects of the safety and efficacy and quality of the product. It also can add to our understanding of value and appropriate use. For example, with J&J, I understand that actually FDA undertook some additional analyses to look at hospitalization to help us better understand the appropriate use of these vaccines and their value. I think FDA often gets overlooked when we think about the ecosystem in terms of the R&D process itself, but we know that early engagement and continuing engagement can actually accelerate the whole process and can improve the science and, as I said, the quality of the products and the innovation as well. I also want to mention the importance of thinking about regulation not just as a national issue, though every country has its own national legal regulatory framework and systems, but it really is a global challenge. We live in a complex, interconnected world, and products that are developed or regulated in any given country probably are coming in whole or in part from other countries, but importantly also in a challenge like COVID-19, the ability to bring together the best minds in terms of understanding the regulatory science issues and to be able to come up with the best guidance across countries towards a common problem is invaluable. Also, in developing studies to be able to create common standards and practices so you can actually look across studies more effectively, you can enroll studies in multiple countries, and ultimately when the companies have to put together their approval packages, it can streamline that process because they're not being asked to have done different studies for different regulatory authorities, and they can draw on a shared experience and approach. I think that we also have to recognize that different regulatory authorities have very different capabilities. And so by working together in a cross-national way, we can help to raise all boats and better assure quality products for people around the world. And this is an issue I started working on when I was at the FDA, trying to actually, with some of my colleagues from around the world, create a new global governance mechanism to help support these activities. And really during COVID, I think that came into play as a very important tool. And I think that the coming together of regulators harmonizing and aligning approaches, sharing experience, sharing data and information, and leveraging resources has accelerated the ability to make new vaccines available, and will continue to be an important framework for action going forward, I think. The last thing that I wanted to mention is just the challenge of uncertainty, something that FDA deals with, every day, but so pronounced during this unfolding pandemic. First, we were dealing with a previously unrecognized virus. We didn't understand all aspects of how it caused disease or the nature of the human immune response. You're always having to make decisions based on limited data. You want the most robust science that you can get, but that isn't always possible. The studies that Monsef talked about were very carefully designed to ask and answer a set of critical questions, but we have to recognize that the acceleration does leave some issues not fully answered. Now, you never know everything you want to know at the time of approval under the best of circumstances, and that's why FDA takes a lifespan approach to oversight of products, including post-market surveillance, which is so important for vaccines and will be in this case. But we also have to recognize, as Zeke pointed out at the end of his comments, that because of the way the studies were structured, certain things were not examined. Maybe they would have been if we had been developing the studies in a slower, more staged way. But the ideal interval for dosing, it may be that actually you get a stronger boost after a more prolonged spacing of the doses. And in the crisis of a crisis like this, certainly there are arguments to be made for deferring a second dose. But on what level of data do you need to make those decisions? Similarly, the dose to be administered, we might have done more dose ranging studies if we'd been moving more slowly, but maybe that certain vaccines you can actually use a somewhat smaller dose. But so I think it's also critical, thinking about our current situation and looking forward, how do we sort of integrate continuous learning and proper flexibility and adaptation in the face of new information? It needs to be scientifically driven and ethically driven to respond to the two first speakers. But I think that FDA and other regulatory authorities have a very, very important role in helping to shape the thinking and the analysis of data, both data that's generated at the request of FDA, but data from other studies or drilling down into studies that have been done in order to be able to respond to changing circumstances and new insights and understanding. Let me just close by saying that I think, remarkable things have been accomplished. The knowledge and experience that we have garnered during the response to COVID tells us we can do things in new ways with new partnerships and new science. We need to invest in that, commit to that, as Monsef said, to prepare for the next pandemic that will surely come. But I also hope that we will all work together to make sure that we harness advances in science and technology, as we have done for COVID-19 response, to address on a day-to-day basis the unmet public health and medical care needs that so challenge and burden countries around the world. Thank you.
Dr. Hamburg, thank you very, very much. Those are clearly cogent, inspiring comments. Please stay around for our questions. We appreciate that.
I will.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce Stanley Bergman, who will be our next speaker. Stanley Bergman has been chair and CEO of Henry Schein, a Fortune 500 company since 1989. Shoot, that's longer than I did it. God bless you, Stanley. Largest provider of healthcare products to office-based physicians and dentists in the world. Henry Schein has been on the Fortune list of the world's most admired companies for over 20 consecutive years. He's been on multiple boards and has received multiple honors. But I really do want to mention one point. When you're the CEO and chairman of a public company, you have a pulpit and you can use it in any way that you wish. And one of the things that Mr. Bergman has done is that he has clearly become a leader and embraced the issues of global health security in all forms, and certainly in his work as being on the World Economic Forum's Healthcare Board of Governors. And it simply is intrinsic to what he's done in being a leader in this field and use his position to be able to try to look for solutions and be able to provide hope and change. His topic will be on the role of public-private partnerships in vaccine distribution and supply chain. Mr. Bergman, thank you very much for being here. We look forward to your comments.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Grodman, for that very nice introduction. It's been a tremendous panel today. Really, so much has been described about how we got to where we are, and it was really enlightening. So I'd like to spend a few minutes, as I was asked, on public-private partnerships. Of course, the World Economic Forum is one of the leading public-private partnerships in the world today, and would like to perhaps zero in on 2 points. One is the importance of PPE. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on vaccines per se, because we've heard a lot. We've got real experts on that. But I would like to draw attention to PPE in particular and the role of physicians in administering the vaccines. Of course, the goal has been to get a shot in the arm for every person around the world. Certainly quite complex, as we've heard today. And of course, we need to be successful with that, because if we don't vaccinate most of the people on the planet, this virus will not go away. Viruses don't carry passports, don't carry visas, and we have to take care of people around the world. We've discussed that today, and obviously that's important. But successful vaccine distribution is not simply about cold chain. As we think about this huge monumental activity that we have to go through from a supply chain perspective, clearly building adequate vaccine supply is an immense global challenge for every country in the world. And the work that COVAX does in the low-income countries is important. And we all know that managing the cold chain capabilities requires a rather complex task. But we also have to recognize, and I believe this has been under-recognized, that ensuring equitable vaccine distribution on a global scale is not only about ensuring the supply of the vaccine, as complex as that may be, or cold chain, as complex as that may be. Transforming a vaccine to a successful vaccination campaign also requires a sustainable supply chain that can deliver on the critical ancillary products required, like gloves and masks, needles, syringes, and the sharps containers. This sounds very simple and not sophisticated. But as we've seen, the supply chain for these and other related healthcare products is very, very fragile. We may have product today, but the supply chain is fragile. Supply chains are designed for maximum efficiency from a pricing point of view, but not to deal with crises. Healthcare supply chains are at risk. In fact, they are a big challenge today. We have gotten through this period by throwing money at it, but my concern is, as soon as this pandemic fades, and hopefully it'll be soon, there will be a new issue, hopefully not a pandemic, an emergency of some sort, a natural disaster, a geopolitical event, labor shortages, raw material shortages, and regulatory challenges that are being masked right now. local issues can have cascading effects. Let me share a couple examples. We all know that there was a perfect storm, actually about a year ago, that put tremendous stress on the supply chain in the early months of the pandemic, causing the shortages we faced globally and continuing actually to this day in some products. 80% of the world's mask production comes out of China. Now, this is not intended to be anti-China or anything like that. I'm merely stating the facts. And much of this is coming from Wuhan. The outbreak struck when the country was closed for the Lunar New Year and factories didn't reopen. Consumers and companies around the world bought massive quantities of PPE, taking it out of circulation for healthcare professionals. Rapidly changing government restrictions on exports and in-country distribution of PPE was rampant. I'm not only talking about some restrictions that were put on exports by Asian countries, but within Europe, countries kept their product. In violation of the EU regulations, these were eventually lifted, but there was a significant dislocation within Europe, within North America. Over the December holidays, shipping containers were packed up with all sorts of goods, and log jams occurred throughout the world, and particularly in US ports. Just a few weeks ago, we learned of a key medical-grade plastic supplier that had a fire, and its facility is now impacting availability of sharps containers. This may not be sophisticated, but it's a serious issue. As the vaccines rollout began in the US, the government determined that it would be necessary to have epinephrine shots. This is a second example on hand for vaccination sites for any rare but possible allergic reaction. However, the EpiPens are not typically produced in quantities required to have them widely available. So given the fragility of the supply chain for life-saving PPE and other products, it is clear that no single sector can address this. It requires public-private partnerships, as was put together for the vaccine. The role of PPP in addressing these challenges is critical. The World Economic Forum was the venue that gave birth to Gavi and CEFI. And in 2015, at the World Economic Forum, in a serendipitous way, we established a pandemic supply chain network. The World Health Organization, the World Bank, the World Food Program, HHS, CDS, the CDC, we're all part of this. And there are now 60 companies that are involved. My concern is that, and this group did some good work in identifying issues, navigating through the complex PPE issues, but my concern is if we don't address these issues with government support around the world, and it's not just one government can't solve the issue because the supply chain is global. We can make a mask in the US, but there's raw materials. Raw materials are not simply available in one country. No one country can do this in isolation. And the big challenge is that today we're prepared to pay a little extra for PPE products. What happens is when we forget these pandemics or epidemics as in the past, and likely the pandemic will not be forgotten that quickly, but there will be a time when the prices will go down again and product will not be made in the US, for example, and the supply chain globally will go back to an even more fractured environment than we have now been able to put together. Spent a little time on the HHS, it was originally the White House, then the FEMA task force, and now the HHS supply chain task force. Together with 5 major other distributors, we worked under the Section 708 of the Defense Production Act. We addressed a lot of challenges. My concern is we put this group together. Will we remember what the group went through a year from now, 2 years from now? I don't know. So from a public policy point of view, turning to organizations like Columbia Public Health, please let's make sure that this fragile PPE and supplies network is not forgotten. So let me address another issue now, and that relates to the role of the physician in inoculation in the United States. From a health equities perspective, of course, we've discussed this. The COVID has laid bare all the problems of the last few hundred years. Data has shown that African Americans have died, with, as you know, at 3 times the rate of Caucasians. And not only have communities of color been hardest hit by the pandemic, but in all 50 states, we are seeing significant and growing equity gaps. If you have a good computer, it's maybe easier and you know how to use it, to get an appointment. If not, not so easy. So what we're advocating and have been working with a number of groups is that vaccines be made available to the primary care physicians in the community. The community's healthcare systems, primary care physicians, family physicians, even dentists and community healthcare centers need to be given access to these vaccines. Very little focus has been put on this so far. The physicians know their patients, they can talk to them, they can get acceptance. The cold chain requirements were very, very difficult for Moderna and Pfizer in the early days, but we're now going to have products available that will not require these extreme cold chain requirements. So asking that focus be given on the office-based physician, the community healthcare center, dentists, and others who are in communities to be given access to these vaccines. These are trusted practitioners in their community and are in dialogue with their patients each day. We're working with the Black Coalition Against COVID to address this issue. The coalition is made up of the National Medical Association, the National Black Nurses Association, historically Black Medical Colleges, and National Urban League, and the National Urban League. But we need engagement from academia in advancing this cause. We need public health people involved. We need to get the word across that healthcare systems, that the healthcare system in this country needs to provide, at the end of the day, provide vaccines to those that are in the communities that are trusted, and they can get the vaccine inoculation rate up. So those are 2 points. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. The PPE system, somebody that's been in the system for 40 years, let me tell you, is fragile. It's not resolved, and we need to make sure that our physicians who are in the communities are given access to these vaccines. So thank you very much.
Mr. Stanley, thank you very, very much for that. I think we often overlook the supply side issues that are there, and we shared a platform in June where we talked about the role of what was done by private companies in working with FEMA. And at that time, it was the exact same. Much of that was not planned, but happenstance of the companies getting together and finding the right contact in the government. And there, it wasn't responding to a global need. It was responding to a need here in this country. And the question was, in another episode like that, would that group stay together? Or is it just, where's the institutional memory to keep it going? So these are all critical issues that you raise, and thank you very, very much. Our next speaker may or may not be on. John Kangasong is right now. I will introduce him and we'll go from there. And hopefully he is obviously having some internet issues and may or may not have video and may not have sound, but we'll be able to cope either way. John Kangasong is the director of the African CDC. That is a transformative role because in one in which he's brought hope and instilled purpose into an ambitious organization that has incredible promise and which has touched all aspects of healthcare. He co-chairs PEPFAR and before assuming his current position was Associate Director for Laboratory Science and Chief of the International Laboratory Branch at Division of HIV and TB at the CDC in Atlanta. Dr. Kangasong, do you hear me? Are you on?
I can hear you very well. Unfortunately, my camera cannot be on, and I will just speak without the camera because my internet is very unstable.
Listen, that's great. Please go ahead. We look forward to your comments.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And again, thanks the organizers for the opportunity to contribute to this very important session. So let me divide my comments into actually three parts. One is where we are with the pandemic on the continent, just by way of introduction, and then the progress and challenges on vaccine distribution, and then what we must do going forward. So first of all, the current pandemic situation on the continent. As a continent of 1.2 billion people, we have reported a cumulative number of about 3.8 million, with over 102,000 deaths on the continent. Let me just put a caveat here that the numbers we have reported on the continent have to be taken carefully, because we now know, based on several surveys coming out from Nigeria and Kenya and other parts, that the number might be a gross underestimate than what we currently are reporting. For the deaths, however, we know that we do not see large amounts of deaths yet on the continent as we are going through the second wave of the pandemic. Now, with respect to vaccines, I think one thing this pandemic has taught us is clearly at least three things. One, that we are more connected than we thought we were. Second is that we are more vulnerable than we thought we were. And lastly, that the inequities that we thought existed are even greater than we knew. And clearly, it is from that perspective of inequities that I will discuss, share my reflections on vaccines. First of all, it is not only limited to vaccines, the issue of inequities to medical interventions. When the pandemic hit the world, Africa was suffered tremendously in the area of diagnostics. As of May last year, we had tested only about 300,000 people. That is out of a continent of 1.2 billion people. And clearly that was because there was no access to diagnostics on the continent. Even when the countries had resources to buy diagnostics, there were no diagnostics to be acquired. Now we see the same game, the same scenario with vaccines, where we were all, last year or 1 year ago, we all agreed that it was important for us to sign a code of conduct. And that code of conduct was that there will be equitable and timely access to vaccines when they become available. But as we know, with the over 200 million people that have been vaccinated, very few have been vaccinated in Africa. I would say literally that very few countries are now beginning to receive their first doses of vaccines on the continent. And yet we know that this pandemic will not be eliminated anywhere in the world, except it is eliminated everywhere in the world. So then that begs the question of how did we manage to fail so woefully in translating the commitments that we made at the start of this pandemic and let it fall into the value of death, where we cannot now vaccinate at the same time across the developing world, especially in Africa. Our greatest nightmare is to read a headline news ahead in future that says COVID-19 in Africa, moving from a pandemic to an endemic disease. I think that would be a horrible headline news for us to bear, given the other challenges that we have, including HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, issues with non-communicable diseases, and the rising threat of antimicrobial resistance. So where do we go from here? I believe strongly that as a continent, we need to embrace a new public health order. A new public health order that speaks to the ability for the region as a continent to begin to focus on manufacturing of both diagnostics and vaccines that are critical instruments to ensure the security, the health security of a people of 1.2 billion people. A continent that aspires to be a continent of the future, where in 30 years we'll be counting 2.4 billion people, and where 1 out of 4 people in the planet will be an African, needs to develop manufacturing capacity on the continent for both diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. Second is that we must absolutely focus on competent workforce development for emergency interventions or disease response. I say this because as Africa's CDC, we have scrambled We've had to work with the military to hire military planes to take to DRC to transport responders to Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Cameroon. We cannot ensure the health security of our continent in that manner. And if we have to develop vaccines, we need a competent workforce. The third thing we must do is actually invest in our own national public health institutes, such as the Africa CDC. It has really been a pleasure for me at the helm of Africa CDC to have briefed the head of states of the continent about 13 times in 1 year. That is literally every month they come together. That speaks to the importance of relying on a solid and functional public health institute that can provide direction and guidance and strategies for the continent. And lastly, we must invest in trusted partnerships with the private sector, trusted partnerships with our donors and funders that align with the priorities of the continent. Some of the greatest lessons I've learned during this pandemic is working with the private sector. People like Strive Masiyiwa, people like Benedict Orama, who run the Afri-Exim Bank, because it's not enough to chat out what we need in public health, but it's very important to work with these people that would develop innovative strategies for both financing, for both developing platforms such as the African Medical Supply Platform that we are now using in distributing vaccines and commodities there. As a continent, we have set up what we call the African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, AVAC, which is really designed to complement the work of COVAX. And through that mechanism, we have secured, as you probably all heard from President Ramaphosa about 6 weeks ago, about 270 million doses of vaccines through that mechanism, and the distribution will start next week. And this will complement at least those doses that we achieved from COVAX. Together, that is the joint efforts between COVAX and AVAC will enable us to achieve the 60%, at least 60% of vaccination that is required on the continent in order to guarantee the safety of the continent and get rid of this pandemic. So to conclude, I would just say that, first of all, we have to invest as a continent, as a people, in health security of our continent and recognize that disease threats are not just a social threat, but they are a serious economic threat, and I'll perhaps say that a serious national security threat for our continent. And investing in domestic manufacturing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics is the way to go in the spirit of a new public health order. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon.
Dr. Kingasol, thank you very much for those comments. We obviously are running on. I really appreciated your comments that in Africa, the pandemic will not turn to an endemic without it becoming a pandemic once again. And that's important for all of us to be able to go realize. So we have limited time before 2 o'clock. I don't know, some people have to go sign off then. And it's not easy to be able to summarize and be able to ask a question to be able to counter all the issues that were brought up. I have to thank all of you because I wanted complexity and you have certainly provided that. So then in the theme that we started, let me go leave it up to the panel. Maybe you can all go join in and we can start in the order in which you spoke. What is the one thing that was accomplished with vaccines over the course of the COVID pandemic? And what is the one element that will remain challenging going forward? Is that a reasonable place to go start? And we have limited time. So Monsef, I know it's not an easy one, but let me know what you think.
There's an obvious one, which is we now know it's possible. And I do think that's a big movement in terms of how in the next setting, population may react to a pandemic. Because I remember in March, April, May, June, people were wondering, oh my God, is this going to last forever? We started thinking it's going to be 15 days and then a month and then forever. And then now we realize, well, it's possible. And I hope it will end up in a place where variants, don't completely change the game again.
And what's going to keep you up that you think we have not, that still remains the challenge going forward, either for new variants or for the next virus, bug, pandemic, whatever? What is unresolved?
I think acceptance and vaccination. I mean, vaccines on a shelf are useless. And I am appalled still that now we are happy that the US polls are showing that we went from 60% of people saying they would not use the vaccine to 60% saying they will use the vaccine. 40% still say they may not use the vaccine. And this is, I mean, in other countries in Europe, France, for instance, I was interacting, that percentage may be even higher. I think we are going to be facing societal challenges in how to accommodate what may appear as individual decisions to be made, and the public health. I mean, if 40% of population are not vaccinated, it will be a big problem.
Okay. Listen, thank you very, very much. Dr. Emmanuel, what worked? I'm not going to say what keeps you up at night, because I'm sure there's more than one thing. So what remains an outstanding challenge?
Well, I think that Dr. Slaoui said it right. What clearly worked is the speed with which we were able to develop vaccines on new technology platforms across multiple technology platforms, rapidly test and rapidly get regulatory approval. Well, not regulatory approval, Peggy will correct me, but authorization. We're waiting for the final approvals, and I think it's important to get them. I think that clearly worked. There are many things that keep me up at night, but I will tell you one of the major things that keeps me up at night is our short-termism. The fact that everyone's talking about now, for the next pandemic, we've got to do this, that, and the other. And yet, as you correctly pointed out at the start, we have a very, very short memory and attention span. And I am worried that we might put in place better institutional structures, better arrangements. But then, if nothing happens for 5 or 7 years, we'll again begin to cut back on the budgets. We'll begin to reduce our commitment and focus. We've seen this over and over again with flu. But I worry that despite how big this is, despite the trillions of dollars that have been lost because of this and the many deaths, 5 or 6 years, we may be on to whatever the next thing is. And that does worry me, because we'll be hit again and we'll be maybe a little better prepared, but not sufficiently better prepared.
With good reason. I mean, we lived through it through Ebola, lived through it with Zika, and all the excitement and a lot of the initiatives just dropped. And the problems still remain. And certainly as it has to do with public-private partnerships and the role of industry, who we can't just assume are going to drop at a moment's notice and change all their priorities. Anyway, thank you very, very much. Dr. Hamburg, what are your thoughts?
Well, the two previous speakers, certainly have captured some of my concerns and my where I have found great optimism and hope. The science coming together and showing us what can be done, and the importance of thinking and acting out of the box to some degree. I mean, there were many naysayers about whether the vision could be achieved. And I think that the level of commitment, focus, and investment, building on advances in science, have produced these extraordinary vaccines. What keeps me up at night is really, picking up on what Zeke was saying, is over and over again, we've seen these cycles of crisis and complacency. I mean, you mentioned Ebola and Zika, but it goes back many decades. And I've been working on these issues for many decades now. And, whether it was SARS or H1N1 or Ebola, or the anthrax letters, going back to that as well, saying, this should be the wake-up call, but then we, as a nation and as a globe, hit the snooze button and go back to sleep. So I hope that this recognition now about, how truly an infectious disease threat can undermine the very fabric of society, can, put brakes on our economy and economic futures, and compromise national and international security, will cause all sectors and all nations to really want to work together to find meaningful and enduring solutions. But I do worry about complacency and hope that, as Zeke said, building and supporting new institutions, really trying to build in new approaches and strategies into our routine work and apply what we've learned every day to make a difference and encourage ongoing investment will help to build us towards better preparedness on top of everything that we need to do specifically for preventing and preparing for a future pandemic.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Stanley, Mr. Bergman, are you still there? I'm not sure. Okay. Dr. Nengersong, are you still there with us?
I'm still here with a bit of
Great.
internet challenges. Yeah.
Yeah. What worked? What didn't? What there's? I'm not going to ask you what keeps you up at night because you probably don't sleep. But what worked and what is going to be remaining challenges? I know you outlined some, but please summarize for us.
I think the remaining challenges will be how do we foster greater international cooperation and solidarity. I mean, we will never be able to solve our pandemic problems if we do not cooperate more, if we do not collaborate more, and if we do not express greater solidarity. There have been a lot of that cooperation in the spirit of having identifying a new virus, sequencing it, and developing a vaccine. But you need more on the delivery side of it, not just in the research side of it. I think science itself has demonstrated that we can cooperate, we can collaborate, but the delivery part of science needs to exercise a little bit more. That is the combination between pathogen, populations, policies, and politics need to be perfectly aligned. Those are the gaps that work that we still have ahead of us. Poor politics, poor policies, even with good science, doesn't go anywhere. And the world needs a better alignment of all those aspects.
Well, thank you very, very much. Your words meant a great deal, and we thank you so much, and we wish you nothing but the best for the challenges and the promise that you have in your position at the African CDC. With that, I want to thank all the panelists, and I want to move on to the next part of our program. Oh, Stanley, are you there? Oh, I don't know. Hi, Stanley, do you hear me?
Sorry.
The last question we asked was...
Sorry, I had a practical issue. I have grandchildren. Sorry.
Well, that is simply a great excuse. One last question we asked: what worked, what didn't, over the COVID episode?
Yeah, what worked, what did not work was...
What is the challenge going forward that's unresolved, but what was a challenge that we overcame that we think we will benefit from in the coming years?
For me, what did not work was the immediate, sorry.
That's okay. No. No.
After, I would say 2 months after the middle of, early part of March, we did not have a PP&E plan. We just did not have one. We can have a plan now. I think we still don't have one, but simply buying product and putting it in a strategic national stockpile is good, but that's not good enough because we don't have enough product to service the needs of the world. There has to be product available everywhere in the world. Otherwise, the thing is going to spread, the next issue. So the next pandemic or emergency or whatever. we need to have a global system, similar to the way CEPI and Gavi worked, where they've come up with a pretty good system for vaccines. We need something like that for PPE. It's not working yet. We don't have it. We're buying stuff. That's not good enough.
That's great. Listen, thank you very much, and thank you for your participation on the panel today. Thank you.
Sorry.
And no. I think it shows life. It's real. I'm sorry they didn't come on screen. Anyway, I wish you the best, and thank you very, very much. I want to be able to move on to the next portion of our panel and to introduce Kai Kupferschmidt. Kai, are you there?
Yes.
Kai is a science journalist who's based in Berlin and is reported on infectious diseases all over the world and has been following the COVID-19 pandemic since January of 2020, like all of us. He writes for the German media, clearly part of Science Magazine. His most recent book is Blue in Search of the Nature's Rarest Color. There's been a lot of talk, Kai. I hope that we've inspired you. People have talked about we've talked about lack of attention span. We've talked about people losing interest. How do you convey issues when the issues can't be disclosed? Because public perception is a lot contributes to the political will of a solution. So we are certainly grateful for you being here, and we're grateful for your perspective on this. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thanks for the kind introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm in Berlin. And given I just wrote a book about color, it might be weird, but I do have a few slides which are all in black and white, and I hope you can see them. So it's an honor for me to talk after so many distinguished speakers and add a few thoughts from a journalist's perspective. But it also strikes me that after hearing so many scientists, the story about this pandemic from a science perspective is it has two sides, right? I mean, there's a lot to celebrate, and then there's a lot to kind of be sad about. And I think from a journalist's perspective, it's much harder to find the big accomplishments in some ways if you look at communication. And I guess the reason that I think it's important to talk about all of this is that I really worry that with all the strides we've made in some areas of reacting to a pandemic, the part that we're actually worst at is maybe the part that we've learned the least on in this pandemic, and that is the communication part. So we've heard a lot in the last days, not just about vaccine development, but about vaccine production, vaccine distribution, their allocation. And the reason, of course, is that a vaccine is a great tool, but a vaccine in a freezer somewhere doesn't do anyone any good. You really have to get it into someone's arm, as Monseslawi also said, in order for it to have any positive impact, in order for it to save lives. And that means that you also have to have people want to be vaccinated. And I think that's where communication comes in. It means that people often talk about that last mile, and how hard that last mile is. And I think when you're talking about vaccines, really, for a lot of vaccines, the last mile really has to be crossed in the rather treacherous terrain of the human mind. That's what it takes, is to convince people to actually want to be vaccinated. And I want to give you just one example, maybe from right here, right now, just to be practical, to start off the talk. So in Germany at the moment, the AstraZeneca vaccine is piling up. Just for context, in Germany, we've been vaccinating with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and then the Moderna vaccine. And most recently, the AstraZeneca vaccine was added to that. So Germany got a shipment of, I think, 1.4 million doses last week. And I haven't checked the numbers today, but certainly on Wednesday, less than 300,000 of those doses had actually been used. And when you talk to people in the vaccination centers, as I've done, and also people who are supposed to be vaccinated now, like healthcare workers that I know, the interesting thing is that you hear a lot of stories about people not wanting this particular vaccine, and you hear a lot of stories of people in the vaccination centers when they hear that they're going to get the AstraZeneca vaccine, starting to shout and leaving and canceling their appointment, or even just starting to cry. And you kind of have to wonder, how do we get to a point like this? How does this happen? Well, in this particular case, you can disentangle it a little bit. I think there are a few reasons. And one of the first ones, one of the first ones is actually has to do with media. It has to do with journalism. And that's that in late January, there was an article in a German economic newspaper called Handelsblatt, and they basically quoted an anonymous government source in Germany saying the AstraZeneca vaccine apparently had an effectiveness of only 8% in the elderly. It's never quite been cleared out what happened there. There's never really been a correction either. But certainly this one anonymous quote traveled far and wide in German media because it became a story that a lot of other outlets also talked about. And so this was one aspect, I think, that really started to seed this idea that the AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance, is a second-tier vaccine. And then, so journalism did play a role in this. And then there are other things. There's the scientific communication. So in Germany, the Standing Committee on Vaccinations at the Robert Koch Institute, which makes the decisions on recommending who gets what vaccine, decided, they wrote in their recommendations that there's not yet sufficient data available to evaluate the vaccine efficacy for the age of 65 years and older. Now, I understand how they reached that conclusion. I don't really agree with it, but I can certainly see how you can reach that conclusion. And other countries have reached the same conclusion. I think France, Poland, I think Italy actually has an even lower age threshold. So you can argue about whether this is the right decision or not, but you do have to realize that a decision like this is in itself an act of communication. And then on top of that act of communication, there's a question how you communicate that decision. And certainly the way that it was perceived in Germany, the way that it was communicated, was that it added to this uncertainty about this particular vaccine. And then as another layer on top of this, of course, you have the political communication. So our Chancellor Angela Merkel was asked in an interview this week about this whole mess, and she explained that the AstraZeneca vaccine has been shown to be efficacious and why people should be confident and take it and what the advantages are. And then she was asked whether she would take the AstraZeneca vaccine, and she answered that she wasn't in the group that was supposed to get it. Angela Merkel is 66. This vaccine is supposed to go to people below 65, so that she wouldn't take it. And somewhat predictably, it led to a lot of newspaper articles also in other countries, like this one, saying, she rejects the Oxford jab. This one's from the Times in London. This is actually a version that they changed. First, it actually said that she refused the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, which again is a problem of journalism. But I think, Mark, you said you love complexity. I mean, you can see in this little, example from the real world, just from the last week or weeks, how all of these different layers interact and play a role. And it's kind of fascinating to me because I have a podcast in Germany in which I talk about global health, and we talked about the vaccines in one episode, and there were a lot of questions at the time about the mRNA vaccines. People were really, really worried. Isn't this a new technology, and how can we be sure it's safe? And this has gone so fast. And you could really, if you explain to people how that process worked and how the vaccines work, you could really allay a lot of those concerns. And it's kind of interesting to see now that in some ways around the mRNA vaccines, you see how communication can have a positive impact. And then with AstraZeneca, you're kind of seeing the opposite. So now that's the vaccine that people don't want, or a lot of people, at least in Germany, don't seem to want. So what can we learn from an episode like this? Well, I think, first of all, it shows that complexity that I alluded to, and that you're right, is everywhere in the vaccine space. It's just an immensely complex topic, which is maybe what makes it so interesting as well. I do want to say it also maybe shows where we should be putting our energy when we talk about vaccines. I mean, when you talk to the people who had, who have these qualms about the AstraZeneca vaccines, you can really tell that they have reasonable questions about the efficacy. What does the data say? Is this vaccine really going to protect me as much as a different vaccine would? And I think there was a very good story in Nature, I think yesterday, explaining why it's very hard to actually compare the data on the different vaccines, and that to know the real life performance of a vaccine in a certain place compared to another vaccine in the same place is just something that's very hard to do. But you can explain that to people. And I think there's sometimes a tendency when we don't have a clear answer to just avoid answering. And what I've always tried to do as a science journalism, and I mean, certainly in this pandemic all the time, the questions that people have raised have been ones that we didn't have an answer to. But the way that you answer that is to say, well, we don't know, but here's what people are doing to try and find out. And here is what we do know about it. And I think that's just something that's increasingly important in this complex world, in this fast moving world, to not create this kind of vacuum where anyone who comes with a simple but wrong answer, basically gets a megaphone and everybody else is quiet because they feel they can't share an answer yet. The other thing is that it's not trivial to decide what misinformation or what battles to wage when we're talking about this. I mean, there's a lot of attention has been paid to the more crazy aspects of vaccine hesitancy or vaccine skepticism. Here's one that came past me yesterday on Twitter. I'll just let you read it. I've had enough crazy for this year. I don't need to read this out loud. But certainly a lot of attention goes to these kind of out there conspiracy theories because people maybe find them fascinating. It makes for good reading. But what we're really talking about when we're talking about public health is a lot of people who have legitimate questions and are just worried and are not adhering to any of those conspiracy theories, but just want to be taken seriously in their concerns. And I think that's something that certainly doctors, but also scientists have not always engaged with on the level that I think we should be engaging with that. Let me maybe talk a little bit about how we can frame all of this. I mean, this is just two examples, but how do we think about the bigger issue here? How do we think about communication? Let me look briefly back and then try and look forwards. When I look back at the past year, which sometimes feels more like a decade, but it's only been a year. And in that year, as a science journalist who's covered infectious diseases for a long time, there was a lot there that didn't really surprise me all that much. Certainly, some of the trappings of a pandemic were apparent to a lot of us and that a pandemic could happen. So it's not the coronavirus that surprised me, it's chloroquine in a way, and the discussion around that. It's not the fact that we are told to wear masks that surprised me, it's how agitated some people got and how much they fought having to wear a piece of cloth. And it's not the threat we are facing that surprised me as much as how many people decided to look away. When I wrote a look back at the year for Science Magazine in December, one of the people I talked to was Bill Hanage, and he said this quote, which I put in the article as well. He said, it's a little like watching a zombie movie in which half of the people can't see the zombies and keep demanding to know what the fuss is about. And that's certainly the experience that I've had. And so let's talk about those zombies for a second and then move on. It's kind of interesting to note, I think, that when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, in some ways, of course, the virus that we're all fighting, SARS-CoV-2, is itself a piece of really clever biological misinformation, right? It's a little piece of almost naked genetic information that gets cells to do something that's not in their own interest. And I'll talk a little bit more about this because there are a lot of parallels, and I think it is worth exploring them. The same goes, by the way, of course, for the vaccines we're using to fight this. I mean, especially the mRNA vaccines are very cleverly designed misinformation. We all know the term herd immunity by now. If you have a virus that an infected person usually infects 3 other people with it, then if 2/3 of the population are immune to that virus, that basically means that one person can only infect one other person, and so the virus can't really spread exponentially the way that it does in a pandemic. And so we call that herd immunity. And the vaccines, of course, are hopefully getting us there, problem solved. But I'm here to talk about the other part of the problem, and that's the people who cannot see the zombies, or who don't want to see the zombies, or who don't care all that much about the zombies because the zombies really only want to eat grandma and grandpa. So I think it's very easy to become disillusioned or to become cynical if you look at the last year, but I really don't think that that's ever helped anyone. And so in the rest of this talk, I'm just going to try and look to the future a little bit and, be aspirational rather than taking stock of what didn't work in this pandemic. And I want to do that by using a concept I encountered on Twitter a few months ago and that I really like, and that's this tweet. So let's say, again, I talked about herd immunity. Let's say one person who's convinced of misinformation on average convinces 3 others. This means R0 equals 3. But if you teach just 67% of people basic epidemiology, statistics, you can get R below 1 containing the infodemic. This is called herd immunity. Now, clearly this is a joke, but I actually think that it's a great concept to get people thinking about the issues that we're actually facing. And, it does get a few things very right, I think. So first of all, misinformation does indeed spread in much the same way as a virus does. And just as we have built an ecosystem in which it has become easier than ever before for a virus in a remote location in a wild animal to spread to a human and then to spread rapidly to millions and millions of other humans, just the same way we have built an information ecosystem, we have built a media ecosystem that allows lies of misinformation to cross into the mainstream much, much easier than before and to infect, if you want to call it that, millions or even billions of people really fast. So I think the consequences of that are fairly clear. When we are talking about things like misinformation, we have to look at the whole system behind it. We have a whole WHO mission looking for the origins of the virus. And I think one thing that we can take from this is that we probably also need to look very hard at the origin of misinformation and disinformation. This is crucial for 2 reasons. First of all, of course, knowing how this happens might help you prevent it in the future and have rules or build the ecosystem slightly different in a way that makes it harder. Now, the second one is that it actually helps you, even with the misinformation that's already in the world, it helps you to counter that. One of the few books that I managed to read last year was Brian Deer's The Doctor Who Fooled the World, in which he describes the saga of Andrew Wakefield and his work as a journalist uncovering it and what's behind the MMR scare. And I think we need a lot more of that. And by that, I mean that it's not enough to just fact check things. It's not enough to just, debunk conspiracy theories or debunk false information. What you really need to do is you need to replace those stories, and very often they're very compelling stories. There's a reason they are spreading, just like a virus that has an R0 of 3 is doing something right, otherwise it wouldn't be spreading this fast. In the same way, misinformation that spreads has some type of infectiousness that allows it to do that. And so what you really need to do is to take a compelling story like that, and then you need to counter it with a different type of story. And that means the real story. How did this misinformation come about? What are the interests of the people who are doing it? What's behind it? Only if you replace this kind of story with the real story, I think you have a shot at really pushing back on some of these issues. And what that means, of course, is that we do need good investigative journalism of the kind that people like Brian Deere, for instance, in the case of the Wakefield saga have done. And this is kind of the ad block here. As a journalist, obviously I have a conflict of interest, but I do think it is important that you support whatever media you see doing those stories, or do whatever you can to support these kinds of efforts. I think another important thing that Nerd Immunity gets right is that everyone contributes. So it's also not right to just point the fingers at certain media outlets and pretend that that's the whole problem. The truth is that I have seen a lot of very high level, very smart scientists, share abysmally wrong stories on social media. And it's very easy to do that. I have done that in the past, and it's very easy to do that. And it's just one click. I think we have to think about this a little bit like we do about, the hand hygiene. In some ways, if you don't want to contribute to misinformation spreading, you have to institute some basics of information hygiene. You have to think about the fact that if you don't do that, you might be contributing to spreading this type of misinformation. And lastly, I think the concept of nerd immunity gets right what the key change is that we have to work on. And that's really, trying to change the individual mind. I think we have to realize that whatever change we want to have in the dynamics of how this plays out, of how misinformation spreads in a situation like this, it can only go by changing one mind at a time. In Germany, we have Christian Drosten, a very renowned coronavirologist who has been doing a podcast. I think it's exactly 1 year today, actually, and who has spent hours and hours and hours explaining the basics of science. And there's an audience for that. He, at some point, I think, had more than 1 million people listen to each episode or download each episode. So I think maybe in the past, I don't think it was ever quite right, but maybe in the past you could argue that as a scientist, it is okay to sit in your lab and do your work and concentrate on that because you are maybe not a great communicator, maybe you don't feel all that comfortable. But I think we're at a point now where you have to realize that maybe the biggest contribution in this particular pandemic that someone like Christian Drosten has actually made was to do that podcast, was to go out there and be available as a source of information that takes the time to explain a lot of things. The interest is certainly there. None of that, of course, is easy. And I think one of the very small things that we could do tomorrow, basically, is to make sure that any scientist has at least a minimum of training and has some experience in the dynamics that are at play here and in communicating to the public. I think it is much more common in the US, for instance, for scientists to have some kind of training, media training or communication training than it is in a country like Germany. But it's a spectrum. And I think also in the US, a lot more could be done and should be done. Maybe as a last point, I think there is, of course, a crucial difference between herd immunity and nerd immunity. I mean, there's a lot of differences here, but I just want to point to one that I think is really important. If you are infected with the virus, with SARS-CoV-2, you end up, hopefully, ideally, for most people, building up some kind of immunity for it, at least for some time. And so you are protected from reinfection for a while. So to some extent, herd immunity builds up by itself. Of course, you are paying a terrible price for it. But that is the dynamic that we have seen in some countries. And I think it's just important to realize that with nerd immunity, what exacerbates the problem with misinformation is that it really works the opposite. Not only does having someone believe a piece of misinformation not protect him from then believing other misinformation, it actually probably makes him a lot more susceptible to more misinformation. So while we pay a steep price for reaching herd immunity in a natural way, that is something that actually happens. With herd immunity, it is 100% on all of us. And I think that if we come out of this pandemic actually realizing that we need to work on that aspect, at least as hard as we've worked on shortening the timescale for developing vaccines, getting them into clinical trials, finishing the clinical trials, getting them distributed around the world, and certainly work more on equitable distribution. I think for me, at least, that might be the key learning if we come out of this working on the communication aspect as much as we have on the rest. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Mark.
Kai, that was an insightful presentation, and certainly it makes us think about things different than what we normally would do. My first thought was that company that does vaccines via nanoparticles, I think just went public through a SPAC last week. I'm not sure, but I'm joking, please. But putting aside all that, you can't separate out the communication. You can't separate that out. And if political will remains a viable, important force, communication has a massive impact on that. To be able to bring resources together, and we live with this all the time. And then you think about all the aspects, whether they be equitable distribution and manufacturing and IP and legal and business and the science, communication stands up there with it. And thank you very much for bringing up those examples. I appreciate it. That was great. Our last speaker today is an honor to introduce. Stanley Plotkin is the emeritus professor at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1991, he was professor of pediatrics and microbiology at Penn, was longtime professor of virology at Wistar. He has authored almost over 800 articles, has edited several books, including textbook appropriately named Vaccines. He's worked extensively on development of a number of vaccines over that time, including anthrax, oral polio, rabies, varicella, and CMV. But we're really honored to have him close the symposium. There's no one who's better be able to go do that. In medicine, I've come to believe that there is the highest honor or title you can bestow. It's not authority, it's not expert, it's not the most quoted source. It's someone to whom you can ascribe not only a domain expertise, but one who has inspired generations of people after him. And that kind of special position has more of a patriarchal lineage. And so for that, Dr. Plotkin, I hope you don't mind if I can take the time to refer to you as the father of modern vaccinology. It's something that you deserve, and a way to think about your contributions over the year. With that, I would like to introduce Stanley Plotkin on State of Vaccinology in 2021, and where do we go from here?
I don't know if you want to see me or not, but my video is muted by somebody else. Anyway, yeah. Okay, fine. All right. So thank you, Mark, for the introduction. My task at the end of this symposium has some difficulties because everything worthwhile to say has been said. But nevertheless, I'm going to take a different tact and talk more about the science. I hope that will be of interest. Next slide, please. And next after that. So the point has been made that SARS-2, COVID-19, is not the first epidemic that has troubled the human race. This is a short list of the epidemics of the past. And note that recently we've had more than the past, in fact, more epidemics than in the past. And that's because we still live in proximity to animals, number one. And number two, we now can travel from Cape Town to New York City in less than a day. And so the world's population mixes very well and carries, people carry with them agents that can cause epidemic disease. Next slide, please. So on the other hand, I want to say that this has been a great year for vaccinology. Now, that statement may be somewhat shocking when you think about the people who have died, when you think about the economic destruction. But the fact of the matter is that vaccinology has never been more developed, more useful than in this last 2020 and now in 2021. Vaccinology is burgeoning. Here is a list of the vaccines licensed since 2000. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but every one of these has been important in preventing epidemic and endemic disease. And now we even have a human papillomavirus vaccine that prevents cancers. And we have the beginning of vaccines against malaria. So this is great. And this should be recognized. Next slide. Now, it has been said here repeatedly that this year has shown that we can develop vaccines very rapidly. And that's true. But what is being forgotten is that it took 20 to 30 years of prior research to reach this point. The messenger RNA vaccines, the DNA vaccines, that all started in the 1990s. And we are reaping the benefits of the 20, 30 years of research that have gone into developing these platforms. So I don't want to hear again the statement that the vaccines were developed in less than a year, because that is really not true. Now, in terms of the new strategies for inactivated vaccines, I'm not going to go into details about each of these, but I would point out that we now have powerful bacterial vaccines based on protein conjugated capsular polysaccharides that are certainly have changed the picture for pneumococcal disease and meningococcal disease. We now can develop more difficult bacterial vaccines using reverse vaccinology, which is essentially using the genomes to identify important proteins that can be used in vaccines. We have the fields of transcriptomics and proteomics to tell us what are the important proteins. And we also have structural biology, which I'll talk about in a second, and a whole variety of new adjuvants, including cytokines, which we've never had before. Again, based on work going back at least 20 or 30 years. And of course, as I mentioned, we have DNA plasmids and RNA vaccines. Next slide. As far as attenuated vaccines are concerned, you know, when I first started out, all that you could do was to sort of try to passage a virus and weaken it in a sort of a blind way. But now we have, for example, codon deoptimization, where you can attenuate by changing the code for amino acids and using amino acids, that is the virus using amino acids that result in attenuation rather than virulence. And we also have vectors, both replicating and non-replicating vectors, but live vectors that present genes, that contain genes from other pathogens and can have those genes be transcribed and translated into proteins, which then, of course, immunize people. Next slide, please. So before talking specifically about SARS-2, I want to talk about the 4 great vaccinology problems that remain and that need to be solved and are on the way to being solved. For example, short effector memory. You know, we do not know at this point how long the vaccines against SARS-2 are going to be protective, and when they will need boosters. Now, next slide. The problem with pertussis vaccine is that although we have replaced whole cell pertussis vaccine, which was reactogenic, by acellular pertussis vaccine that has eliminated serious reactions, but the disease is resurgent because immunity wanes after acellular pertussis. Next slide. And that is a matter of 3 or 4 years, the immunity waning. So what can we do to improve the situation? Well, in the case of pertussis, we can add stronger adjuvants to stimulate T cell responses that act on B cells to prolong their immunity, their presence, and therefore antibody immunity, as well as local production in the mucosa using stimulation of Th17 cells. Also, we can genetically inactivate pertussis toxin instead of using chemicals. And the genetic inactivation allows the persistence of epitopes that are more immunogenic and therefore will give more prolonged responses. And lastly, we now have in development a live attenuated Bordetella pertussis, which could be used particularly as a booster to the acellular vaccine to generate local immunity. Next slide, please. Now, influenza illustrates the problem of pathogen variability and the need for multiple antigens in vaccines. Next slide. We all know that there are live and inactivated vaccines for influenza, but the inactivated vaccine is less effective in children and the elderly. The live vaccine is totally ineffective in the elderly. Both types are less effective if circulating virus has changed from the previous year. And if we're honest, vaccine efficacy is only moderate at best. Next slide. So how can we improve the efficacy of influenza vaccines? Well, this is an improvement in process. We have added a second lineage of type B influenza virus, which improves the efficacy. We have higher hemagglutinin dose vaccines, which improves the efficacy. We have now adjuvanted influenza vaccines, including what are called toll-like receptor agonists, and they are improving efficacy. We could in the future add other antigens from influenza virus, such as neuraminidase, to improve efficacy. And also, the last line, conserved epitopes from other proteins in the influenza virus, including what's called the stalk of the hemagglutinin. Next slide. Now, this is a cartoon of the influenza virus hemagglutinin. The red on top is the head, and that's the part that mutates from year to year, but that's the part which is responsible in the vaccines that we have for immunizing people. In other words, it's the antibody responses to the head that we use to protect people. But as I just said, they change, and therefore the efficacy may disappear. So it's been discovered recently that the blue, the stalk, is a relatively conserved protein. It doesn't change much. So the idea is to use the stalk as well as the head to in vaccines to better protect people. Next slide. And that is being done in an interesting way. The obvious strategy would be simply to use two different viruses to sort of rev up the immunity, but actually that doesn't work too well. It's shown at the bottom. You know, you just take off the head and use the stalk. But what does seem to work is the top, where you use two different hemagglutinin viruses, but with the same stalk. And what happens with the second injection is that the immune system has seen the stalk before, and it reacts better to the stalk than with a single dose. And this, we are hoping, is going to improve influenza vaccines. And one more slide in influenza, next slide, is to illustrate an important immunologic fact, which has been discovered over recent years, and that is that neutralization, which is the easiest test to use in a sense, is not the only type of antibody that can be protective. Now, I won't go into detail in this slide, but just to say that there are other functions of antibody, like antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, that influences the action of natural killer cells, and that these functions may be just as important or more important than neutralization. And so the idea now is to use the multiple responses of the immune system to generate protection, rather than only one that may not be the most important. Next slide. Now, respiratory syncytial virus is the most important respiratory virus of infants, and also the second most important one for the elderly. But we've never been able to make a good vaccine against RSV. We haven't been able to generate good protective responses. And it turns out that structural biology may now help us. The next slide. Well, I've already said, made a couple of points on this slide, but the third point here is that we've tried to make vaccines, but in some cases, they've even worsened disease. And we now have an explanation for what caused that, as I will show you on the next slide. But this development has gone on now over 40 or 50 years. Next slide. And the discovery was that if you take the fusion protein, which is the most important stimulator of antibodies of the respiratory syncytial virus, shown in the center of this slide, that people have said to themselves, well, this is the most important protein, let's use it. But in order to produce it in cell culture, they inoculate the virus into cell culture and harvest the fusion protein. But what happens, shown on the left part of the slide, is that the structure of the fusion protein changes. And in that change, it loses important epitopes that stimulate neutralizing antibody and other types of antibody. Shown on the right part of the slide, the right cartoon shows the location of 4 epitopes that are destroyed when you go from the pre-fusion to the post-fusion form, but which can be preserved by altering the structure of the fusion protein, and that protein is now being developed as a vaccine. Next slide. So the fourth problem I want to point out is the need in some cases for multiple protective responses, not just one important protective response, but that there are multiple responses. Cytomegalovirus is the #1 cause of congenital abnormalities in fetuses. That is, when the mother is infected and transmits the virus to the fetus is born with severe abnormalities. Next slide. A short list of those abnormalities is shown on this slide. And as I've said, this is a very prevalent cause of congenital abnormalities. So how to make a vaccine? I personally have been working on this now for many years. Next slide. And in this cartoon of the structure of cytomegalovirus, what I want to point out is that on the surface of the virus, there are several important proteins. The arrow points to one of them called glycoprotein B, but there's another one at the bottom, a pentameric protein that is 4 different proteins put together. And there are internal proteins in the virus that are important. And what is necessary then is to have vaccines that produce multiple different responses to different parts of the virus. The next slide, I'm going to skip. Let's move on to the next slide. And to say that as with SARS-2, there are multiple CMV vaccines in development in 2021. And this is, again, because of the development of vaccinology over the past years. Now, again, I'm not going to read this whole list, but just to point out that there are proteins being used. There are so-called dense bodies, which I don't have time to discuss. There's also DNA and RNA vaccines for cytomegalovirus, not just for SARS-2, but again, showing the multiple strategies that are now possible. So now let's turn to SARS-2. Next slide. And the SARS-2, essentially, as we can see now, is presenting the problem of strain variation. Next slide. This is a cartoon of the virus, which probably you all recognize, and to point out that the spike protein is on the outside, and that's what most of the vaccines are using as the vaccine antigen. Next slide. So what is new about vaccination for COVID-19? Well, one thing I have to emphasize, especially after the last talk, is the great desire of the public for vaccination. This is different than in the past in many cases. Maybe polio was the last vaccine target that had such public support. Second, that multiple strategies are being used for vaccine development, as I just illustrated for CMV. The third point is also extremely important. We have lots of financial support from governments, which has not always been the case for other vaccine targets. Fourth is the importance of mutations, as I've illustrated to you, as in influenza. And the fifth point is that there are multiple manufacturers involved. And I want to stress this point because somehow in previous speakers, they've lost this point. And that is that so-called lower and medium income manufacturers are involved in making vaccines against SARS-2. It is not true that only first country manufacturers, rich country manufacturers are involved in making vaccines against SARS-2. Next slide. So we have different vaccine platforms being used. An activated platform, very simple, Chinese vaccine. We have a vaccine based on codon manipulation, which is being developed, as you can see, with the help of the Serum Institute of India. We have adenovirus vectors. We all know this, what's been mentioned. We have several different ones. And actually, I neglected to put on this slide Gamaleya. They're the Russian company that is using both Ad26 and Ad5 in their vaccine. There's also a measles vector being developed. That is measles virus as a vector carrying the gene for the spike protein of SARS-2 and another vector, vesicular stomatitis virus. Next slide. And in addition to that, as you know, we have proteins, simple spike proteins being used as vaccines. The Chinese clover, Sanofi Pasteur and GSK, although I'm not sure where that combination, whether that still exists, but Novavax certainly is a protein, a nanoparticle vaccine that looks pretty good. And there are others. And then, of course, DNA plasmids developed in Philadelphia, actually, and the messenger RNA vaccines, which you all know about. Next slide. I think I will skip this in the interest of time. It shows the mechanism of the messenger RNA. And this also, whoops, please go back one. Well, all right, I beg your pardon. And next slide, please. Yeah, okay, so this shows the as part of the landscape, not all of the vaccines, but most of the vaccines in the forefront of development, and shows the timelines. And it's been justly emphasized that people moved fast during 2020 to develop the vaccines, a lot of help from the FDA. And in 2021, we can look forward to the authorization of multiple vaccines, not only the 2 or 3 that we have now, but other vaccines shown on this slide, including the Novavax, the J&J Janssen should be, is ready now. And the AstraZeneca probably will get into the US as well. Next slide. And this slide shows a technical point, but I think perhaps it's just worth mentioning out of interest, and that is the importance of deriving a correlate of protection for the SARS-2 vaccines. That is to say, what is the antibody response that is important? So the good news is that it appears that neutralizing antibodies themselves are the correlate of protection. And the reason for thinking that is shown on this slide, which I wish I had more time to go into it, but basically what this slide shows for 6 different vaccines is the comparison of their neutralizing antibody responses with the responses of convalescent SARS-2 patients. So in other words, the standardization is against the responses of patients to the infection. And from the left to the right, one sees that you have declining efficacy, but also you have declining relationship between the neutralizing antibody response and the convalescent response. So that for the mRNA vaccines, for example, you see that they're 3 or 4-fold higher than the immune responses after infection. When you go down in that number, on the right, you also go down in efficacy. So that is indicating to us that the neutralizing antibody response will be a good correlate of protection. So let me conclude then, next slide, with what I call the known unknowns. We do not know at this point for sure the importance of T cell responses as well as antibody. It does appear that they are not terribly important, but we have a lot to learn. The second point is the receptor binding domain is the part of the spike protein that induces the clearest neutralizing antibody responses. But some of us, including myself, think that other parts of the spike protein are responsible for antibody responses that help with the protection. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know how long these antibody responses will be. Will we need annual boosters? Another important point is we're not yet quite sure whether these vaccines will stop replication of the virus in the nasopharynx, which obviously impacts on the spread of the virus. So an important point. And actually, the last line is a mistake of repeating the first line. The last slide, next. It's been mentioned that for some vaccines, there are questions about responses of the elderly who do not respond as well to many vaccines. So we need vaccines that will cause similar responses in the elderly to those seen in the young. Will vector immunity become a problem? If you immunize people with adenoviruses again and again, are they going to become immune to the vector? Will decline in immunity lead to frequent infections, or will people be protected by memory? In other words, that they will have a jump up in their antibody when they're exposed again, and therefore will not need boosters. We don't know that. And the next to the last point, will COVID-19 become endemic? Personally, I think it will. I don't see how we're going to eradicate the virus yet, but we'll have to wait and see. And the last point indicates that this slide is a couple of weeks old because SARS-2 will continue to mutate. There's absolutely no doubt about that anymore. And we're going to have to determine how best to deal with those mutants. Will we have multivalent vaccines? Will we simply change vaccines from year to year? These are points to which we do not yet have answers. But vaccinology will continue to develop, and I am confident that these problems will be solved. Thank you very much.
Dr. Plotkin, thank you very, very much for the presentation. You know, you've reminded us that behind everything is the science, and that the work that's been done and the remarkable achievements over the course of the last year has been built on the foundation that you've done over your career, and you and your colleagues and those people that you've inspired over that time. And it's an important lesson for us to remember that at all times. Thank you very much for your participation today. As we move to close the symposium, I need to be able to go add a few thanks that are somewhat special for us. I need to go in and thank all the people over at Columbia, President Bollinger, Provost Katz Nelson, certainly our deans, Anil Rustig and Linda Fried and their staffs who've made all of this possible. I need to thank Wafa El Sadr. Wafa is a treasured, heart of Columbia, and I thank her for moderating on one of the days. I need clearly to go thank my co-conveners, Larry Stanberry, Phil LaRussa, and Wilmot James. Larry and Phil are superb vaccinologists who devoted their career to this area and have worked tirelessly, not only to be able to make the symposium possible, but also in the role of educating a new generation of professionals, medical students, other associated healthcare personnel in vaccinology. Wilmot James is an incredible talent that we are fortunate to have with us. Their efforts have brought an interdisciplinary approach to the issues of global health security, which for many of us started as early as 2016. And this symposium, this has been an ambition for us for almost 3 years. I need to personally thank someone else, Dr. Steve Nicholas, who's worked with me at the outset of our efforts here at Columbia and was instrumental to be able to bring Wilmot to Columbia, and without whose vision and talents, none of this would be possible. Wilmot, we are lucky to have you here at Columbia. You've shown the talent to be able to bring people together and put them into a forum where they can express their views, which is critical more than ever. The program in vaccine education is made possible by an unrestricted gift from Pfizer, but this clearly needs some background. Discussions about this gift started in March of 2018. Actually, the first discussion was in 2017 and was not consummated until the end of 2019, well before COVID was on the horizon. At that time, Catherine Jensen at Pfizer, who runs all of the vaccine enterprise, wanted a collaboration because having spent her career, like Phil, like Larry, in vaccines, she was worried that vaccinology was not attracting and training younger people into vaccine science. And she wanted to find ways to inspire those people to move on to careers in the development, distribution, in the continuum of vaccines. That's what made this possible before there was a COVID. Catherine, I think that although this did not occur under ideal circumstances, I think you can be rest assured that the issue of inspiring younger professionals is not going to be in question anymore. Also, to all of our participants today and all the participants this week, there is a phrase, a biblical phrase that I have never forgotten. It says that one is not compelled to complete every task, but one is not permitted to withdraw either. We've talked a lot today about whether we're worried about the attention span, whether all of the interest in the initiative will stop. Well, to all of our speakers who gave of their time, but have given so much of their lives into these efforts, to the thousands of people who are behind them, who've contributed to their contribution and to their work, to the tens of thousands of people who've touched every aspect of not only vaccine development, but global health security, even the commitment they've shown well before COVID, I get a sense that there's very little indication that there's any inclination to withdraw. Why don't we put up the thank you slide? There are a number of people who have made this possible. As you can see, people inside Columbia, people in social media, Joe Week, so many people. Lucky, thank you. All of them have made this something that we have dreamt about. We think this forum is important. We think the complexity is important. We think communicating it is important. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you, and I appreciate your involvement. And again, thank you everyone who's made this symposium possible. Thank you.